6th is called to order. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to everyone present, to our television viewers. All items that we voted on have been posted as required by state law. This meeting is being televised live, then will be replayed throughout the next 2 weeks. Please check the board website for replay times. Director Knowles and Director Reagan are absent today. And we'd like to start with citizen comment. Ms. Houston, is there anybody signed up?
No, there's not.
Okay, so we move on to an update on the Elementary and Secondary Education Act waiver. Superintendent Smith, would you like to introduce the item, please?
I would. And so I'm going to actually ask Sue Ann Higgins, our Chief Academic Officer, and Melissa Goff, Executive Director of Teaching and Learning, to come on up and do a little more information on this one. And as you know, Oregon applied for a waiver to No Child Left Behind, and was granted the waiver, which means the accountability system looks different this year. And so Sue Ann and Melissa are going to walk us through what the interim accountability system is for the state and how that impacts public schools. Melissa.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, and I want to apologize in advance for the fact that we are at still a learning phase with regard to the implementation of the waiver and the new accountability system. We are doing a larger training with ODE next Monday, and so what we'd like to do is update you with the information we understand now, and also some of our active questions. And so we're just working on getting this uploaded so that you can see. Did you get PowerPoint as well? Okay, excellent. So as you're aware, Oregon's been granted a conditional waiver predicated on a number of changes, some of which aren't fully shaped yet with regard to teacher and principal evaluation. But in the meantime, the accountability system that's approved impacts the new report card system. Just small technical difficulty. So the pilot project for 2012-13 is to look at sort of how will this larger framework use evidence about both student achievement now and student growth over time to measure how schools are doing. And so we are very excited about using this new pairing of measures so that there's a measurement for students relative to their peers and relative to students who have performed at their prior levels, as well as an overall achievement growth expectation. So Melissa, at this time, will sort of talk us through the comparison between our old growth model and then the new growth model so we can lay those out.
And I apologize, my computer isn't quite sending, so you're going to need to refer to this, please. So the old growth model, if you go to that page that says the less technical description, students were compared against themselves in the old growth model. That's what we're accustomed to. And then kids were given individual growth targets if they didn't already meet standard. So if you were a student who already met the standard, there was no growth target established for you. In addition, the points were based upon closing your gap from meets within 3 years. So knowing that that meets target changes year to year, it was an accelerated plan for students to be able to get to meets within 3 years. It was a really simple way to calculate, and we could calculate that for our students ourselves, which was a nice piece. But you could not calculate targets for students who weren't tested the year before. So if you flip to the next page, and if anybody wants copies, we have some here. Sorry. So now we're looking at a norm referenced model. So student growth is compared to students who performed at that same level as they did in the years prior. So now it's not just looking at students against themselves, it's looking at students against the growth rate of similarly performing students in the year before. So if I scored 232 this year and Sue Ann scored 232 this year, then we would look at our scores next year to see how much did Sue Ann grow compared to how much I grew. And there's percentile growth target based upon that. So just from that information, we know that we can't replicate it because we don't have access to all of the student scores across the state, and the state's using the collective scores across the entire state to make the calculation work. So it's a little bit difficult for us in the verification piece, but what is nice about it is that we're able to really see this norm referenced percentile growth target, which is more meaningful. And all kids get targets. So every child, even if they met, has a growth target for the future. Okay. Questions about individual students?
I have a couple questions real quick. So one, it sounds like test scores are the only thing that's being used to determine whether or not somebody is a peer of another person. Is that there aren't any other risk factors or demographics?
Correct. Yeah.
Then the second question is, if the growth target is based on somebody not meeting to getting them to meeting, at least that's what it was, what are the new growth targets for kids that are meeting or exceeding? What are they based on? Average growth? Typical growth?
It is. It's based upon average growth. So when you're looking at percentile, you're actually comparing where students lie in a percentile of performance. So if we both met on the state standard, so we each had a score of 232 and that met, then the next year we would calculate out what everybody who had a 232 received, and were we in the top quartile, were we in 75% and above, or were we in the third quartile? Where did we end up landing? And that's where your target is. So it's difficult because you can't easily predict what that target will be. Does that make sense? Okay.
So for students who don't meet, and you still are looking at getting them to meet within 3 years, but how fast they do that would depend on how fast other like students across the state do that. I mean, is that part of the calculations? It's not just if you can go 3 years.
Whether they're making typical growth calculates into how we set the level grades for the students. So you have a target in order to close within 3 years. If you outperform that target and most of your peers underperform that target, then your score weights differently for your school. Does that make sense?
So your school is outperforming the state then, right?
Well,
With respect to you.
with respect to you. Yeah, with respect to you. Exactly.
So again, it's all based on statewide data. So we're not controlling any of this. It's all based on statewide, but then it'll come back down to both the school level, the district level, the school level, and then the individual. Because those reports are already confusing as it is. So maybe I'm getting ahead of things here, but the parents are going to receive a report that shows their child's score and then where they should be compared to their peers around the state in 3 years?
I'm not sure if they'll be
I mean, this is
receiving that
all-
report. That's an excellent
I
question.
mean, everything you're presenting is what the state is doing. I
It
think we need to
is.
clarify that. This is not our plan.
No,
This
and-
is the state's system. So we're just trying to, I mean, they're figuring it out as they go. And
They
you
are.
guys are
They-
trying to.
They are, and it's been a really rapid turnover into rolling it out to those of us who are in the trenches so that we
Right.
understand exactly how it's being configured as well. However, it also is just a 2-year gap, Phil. So we do know that with the smarter balanced assessments coming in, then we'll be going cross-state. We'll have comparative data for students across many states, and we'll be changing that formula again.
Wow.
So this is just a limited time. Okay.
So explain for us as a reminder and for the audience what you're talking about with smarter balanced assessments.
Okay,
Because,
so,
I don't think
Right.
that somebody in the general public would have any idea what you're talking about.
okay, so the federal government has supported the development of 2 different assessments, one called Smarter Balanced and the other called PARC. Both are norm reference tests that are designed to assess students in reading and mathematics, both below and above grade level. So it's quite different than what we have right now. Right now, what we have is when students are in 4th grade, they are only assessed on the 4th grade reading standards. What the Smarter Balanced Assessment, which is a consortium of states, mostly on this side of the Mississippi, and then PARC is just another group of states that are all in it together, but the assessments themselves serve the same purpose. What those assessments will do is allow that 4th grader to be assessed on skills well below 4th grade and on skills way above 4th grade. So it really allows a better diagnostic for us as far as knowing how our students are growing. The difference with Oaks is that when we're looking at a 4th grade test versus a 5th grade test versus a 6th grade test, they don't tie together. So if I exceed on a 4th grade test, that just tells you I really know all the 4th grade standards really well. It does not tell you that I know the 5th grade standards at all.
Okay, that's
That makes
really
sense?
helpful. So this new model really should be more helpful in the information that it gives teachers and administrators in determining what students need
It will.
and what they're really capable of.
Right.
If they're above, if they're meeting the grade level that they're at, and maybe they're above that, you'll have some idea of where they are, what skills they have.
Yeah, I really think you're going to find the value for 2 student groups. One are students who are talented and gifted students who tend to perform quite highly on the state standardized test, but we don't necessarily see the threshold of growth that we would like to be able to report to their parents. And then the other are students who are performing below grade level, and we don't have any information that's very diagnostic for that right now without additional assessments, which is what we do.
Okay, good, thank you.
Yeah. So if you turn to the next page, the school rating methodology, and I know you're going to have more questions about this than I will be able to answer, so we will do the best we can. So schools are evaluated in 5 categories, and these should be familiar to you: student achievement, student growth, subgroup growth, graduation, and subgroup graduation. What's different is the growth calculation for students that I was telling you about earlier. So whereas you were looking at students hitting their own individual growth targets, now when you're evaluating a school's success, you're taking a look at, of the students who are performing at a certain level, how many of them were in a very high quartile of performance, where they actually outperformed many of their peers who were at the same level in years past. That makes sense? Ask if it's confusing. So schools receive scores in every category, and then the scores are combined into an overall score. And so we included for you the categories and the weights for the schools. So if you look in the left-hand column, and I'll read this aloud so that the audience who isn't privy to this can hear. Achievement, growth, and subgroup growth are all assessed and weighted for elementary and middle schools, with growth aggregated growth being 50% of the score that schools get. Subgroup growth, those are individual subgroup populations that include Black students, American Indian Alaska Native students, Pacific Islander students, Hispanic students, ESL, and special education. So that's what we're looking at for subgroup populations. For high school, you see quite a different shift. So 50% has to do with those achievement and growth targets, and the other 50% is related to graduation rates. Does it make sense? With 35% being regular graduation and 15% being how our subgroups do. So the value in this is that we're still looking at subgroup categories. The difficulty is they join multiple categories together, and so we feel it's still incumbent upon us to be disaggregating our data by each subgroup. We actually found, as we started to go through our data at the end of last week, once it was released, that for example, our American Indian Alaska Native data is not reported to us by ODE because of the smaller numbers. We have to have an N size of 42 at a school site. And as we've discussed before, students may choose multiple races when they register for school, but it defaults to a single race. So if students have identified themselves as American Indian and Alaskan Native, we don't have enough who only identified that way to get an aggregate score from the state. So the difficulty, just to draw the thread through for all of you, the difficulty with that for us is that we cannot see how those students are doing as compared to all of their peers who scored at the same level across the board. And we can't replicate that data because we don't have access to that data across the state. Make sense? So the good news, next page, these are our schools that have a level 5 rating. So that's Ainsworth, Beverly Cleary, Bridle Mile, Buckman, Chapman, Dunaway, Forest Park, Laurelhurst, West Sylvan, Woodstock, and 3 of our charter schools, Emerson, Opal, and Arthur Academy. Also of note is that, as we said earlier, actually, I'm not sure we said earlier, but part of the designation for priority and focus and model schools is that schools needed to be Title I eligible. As you know, we have really raised our Title I threshold, raised the free and reduced lunch percentage quite high in our system. So both Buckman and Arthur Academy would, when we went back and compared other schools who have been identified as model schools, the free and reduced lunch percentage that they used in other districts, both Buckman and Arthur Academy would have been listed as model schools had we used that same free and reduced lunch cutoff. Questions? So, focus, priority, and model. I talked about that just a minute ago. Priority schools are our schools that are our lowest performing 5%, and our SIG schools are automatically still labeled as priority schools. Neither King nor Madison would have ended up as priority schools had they not already been SIG schools. So every SIG school was automatically remaining a priority school. And then,
Can I just add one
yeah.
clarification? So it's important again to note that there are sort of 2 ways to look at this. So while every school is being given a level ranking, the schools that might qualify as priority, focus, or model schools are only schools that are Title I. And so there's a separate category in which Title I schools are evaluated. And because we've concentrated our Title I supports in K-8 schools with 60% or more students at the free or reduced lunch rate, we then have a fairly small number of schools that were being given this additional level of evaluation, and reduce the number of schools that might have been considered model, as Melissa just said as well. So, so it allows us a really acute focus on a smaller number of schools, and it folds in the previously identified SIG schools, Roosevelt, Madison, and King. Thanks. Go ahead.
Thanks. And so you'll also see on the next page our focus schools, which are our Title I schools that were among the 6 to 15% lowest performing in the state. So our priority schools are the 3 SIG schools we just mentioned, Ockley Green, Rosa Parks, and Woodlawn. And our focus schools are Cesar Chavez, Jefferson, Rigler, Scott, Whitman, and Woodmere. We have been working already with most of those schools fairly intensely in working with developing an intervention system to impact their students. We have only really begun that work in earnest in the last 18 months, so not seeing it pay off yet for us and for those schools is not necessarily a surprise. But as Sue-Ann says, it does give us a very narrow scope on which we can focus.
Excuse me, just one quick question. I know you said all the SIG schools are priority schools because they're SIG schools, but some of them wouldn't be, and I just kind of missed which ones.
Mm-hmm. I believe that neither King nor Madison would be.
Okay. And so do you know where they would fall then if they were not SIG schools, how they would be rated? Would they be focus schools or would they be something else?
I don't know, but I can find that out for you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just curious.
Yes. So three sort of significant impacts for us in terms of what's different between this and the previous NCLB school ratings and AYP. So one is that there are no more NCLB transfers at schools that are in improvement status. And so, of course, that had a large impact this year on our enrollment and transfer and mapping where students go. So it really allows us to concentrate on the neighborhood schools being the right schools for kids to the degree possible. No more mandatory supplemental education services, so it allows us to be continue to be strategic about how we use those supports and services. And then there's additional information pointing to PPS schools experiencing success with specific student groups growing academically. So this will allow us to really zero in on where do we see promising practice within the district as well as statewide, and really focus and learn from those schools. So it should really help us be much more thoughtful about school-to-school learning and strategic initiatives to make sure that all student groups are moving forward.
So before you move on, as you mentioned that no more mandatory supplementary educational services, so that means that whereas before, at least the way that I saw it played out at the schools, many of the parents themselves chose like different entities to provide those services. Mm-hmm. Are you saying that there'll be the district will now have much more control in regards to how it uses those funds?
I don't know yet what the guidance specifically will be about this and how it will change current practice, or past practice for this year. Do you have a sense of that?
The shortest answer is that we have a set-aside amount from Title I dollars that we have had to, by statute, spend on supplementary educational services in the defined way by statute. That parameter has been taken off as a result of this change. So, and I'm with Sue Ann. We don't yet know if there's going to be any other ties, perhaps, to the schools that are listed as focus and priority. Okay. So one of the things that is going to be a major question, particularly from our principals and teachers, is what kind of support do our schools get? Our parents are going to be concerned with that as well, I'm sure. First of all, individual supports need to be put in place based upon an individual school's needs. And when you look back at that list of schools, there are some really different schools, schools that have very different needs, both in age range of student that they serve, but also in populations that they're reaching. We also will be required to have each of the schools develop a comprehensive achievement plan, and that's with school, district, parents, staff, and community. And the intent of that is to really have the entire community wrestle with how can we shift things, shift the trajectory of performance that we're seeing in these schools. And then on Monday, August 13th, there's a workshop for school leaders and district staff and school teams to find out more information from the Oregon Department of Education as far as what supports ODE will be providing to districts. We are not sure on that at this point.
What we believe is that there's not a sizable new investment from the state to support this, desirable though that may be. We do believe that there will be a $5,000 stipend to support schools initially, and we think probably around building their comprehensive achievement plan and sort of putting in measures in place to get them started to shift direction and zero in on the students that are struggling to achieve. So, but again, we're looking for guidance there. So that will be certainly one of the challenges of moving the dial on this, but not one that we can wait for completely. So, thank you.
So, and just a couple things. One, just to note, we do have in most of these schools, we have extra supports through school improvement specialists that we're going to be able to utilize and perhaps have their job shift a bit in the role that they play this year in supporting these schools. I also think it's important to note that when you look back at at the data for all of our schools, over 90% of the schools in Portland Public Schools have a level 4 or a level 5 score in at least one or more areas. So it's not, it's important for us to realize that there is expertise within our district for almost every single category that we've been looking at. And what's excellent about this data that we just have received is we can look very finely at data for specific student groups at an overtime look, at particularly with growth. And it's the first time we've really been able to do that with meaningful growth. So we do have places to begin looking, and I didn't want to let that go unmentioned.
Any other questions, comments?
No, just thank you for starting. I mean, clearly this is going to be something we'll come back and continuing to do information to you as we're getting our arms around it, and as ODE is.
Can I just confirm the state is giving us $5,000 per school, and that's their support for turning around schools? I just want to confirm that.
That's just the newly designated schools, so I don't believe the SIG schools
Stay
receive
with
that.
their,
Yeah.
the six
Yeah,
schools
school
continue
improvement
with their
grant, they've
current-
gotten a grant, and that's great. I
Yes,
just want to clarify that, because that's pretty
Yeah,
astounding
so
to me.
that's our understanding, is that that's the.
Pretty astounding in the
Supply.
minimum of the
Yeah.
commitment by the state,
That's-
right? I mean,
yeah.
not astounding as in that's great.
No, it's astounding to me that they're saying that there's going to be supports to help. I mean, that's enough for maybe a couple facilitated meetings and some donuts. I mean, it's really, wow, okay.
Yep.
And to note, we do have school improvement specialists at most of those schools, but not at all of them.
Right.
And so how are we going to address the needs that we know that some of those schools will have?
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now gonna move to the items on the business agenda. Ms. Houston, are there any changes to the business agenda?
There is one change. Resolution 4634 on page 3 of the business agenda has been withdrawn.
4634. Okay, so before we move to the business agenda, the request of the Director Morton, we want to have a separate vote on Resolution 4636. So can I have a motion to approve Resolution 4636?
So moved.
Director Morton is not on this one. Director Vilaya moves and Director Atkins seconds for approval of 4636. Is there any discussion on this resolution? So we now vote on Resolution 4636. All those in favor, please indicate by saying yes.
Yes.
Resolution is there any? I'm sorry. This was supposed to be a brief meeting. That's why. Are there any votes against opposed Resolution 4636? If so, please indicate by saying no. Are there any abstentions or abstentions? So, Resolution 4636 is approved by a vote of 4-0, and with Director Morton abstaining from this vote, and Student Representative Garcia voting.
Yes.
Thank you. So we now move on for approval of the rest of the business agenda. I already haven't voted on Resolution 4636 and Resolution 4634 being withdrawn. Do I have a motion and a second to adopt the business agenda?
So moved.
Director Morton moves and Director Atkins seconds the adoption of the business agenda. Ms. Houston, is there any citizen comment on the business agenda?
No.
Is there any board discussion on the citizen agenda, on the business agenda? No noon meetings for me. No? So the board will now vote on the business agenda. All in favor, please indicate by saying yes.
Yes.
All opposed, please indicate by saying no. The business agenda is approved by a vote of 5-0 with Student Representative Garcia voting.
Yes.
Thank you. So the next meeting of the board will be a regular meeting held on August 20th at 5 p.m. here at the board auditorium. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you.